vocabulary has improved. A lot of times students struggle understanding the test questions because their vocabulary isn't there yet. So the terms and the way things are presented, they don't quite have an understanding of the terminology, so the questions become more difficult than they are. So that's why, if you noticed on all the notes, I said make sure you define the terms, understand what the definitions are, because understanding the definitions will help you with the test questions. Even though I don't ask, per se, the definition, if you don't know the definition, sometimes the questions read harder than they are. And I find that's actually why a lot of students struggle with the questions, is they don't necessarily know exactly what the word means, and then if you don't know what the word means, it sounds confusing. So that's why there's usually, for every class you take, there are very specific words that have specific meanings for each class. All right, so what we're going to do today is, I'm hoping this will work. Oh, give me just a second so I can pull these slides up, because they are not liking me today. But every now and then I have that problem. Are there any other questions? Another thing to talk about, Amber, I think you asked the question, is on the test, there is always a practice test, so you can kind of get a feel of how the material will be covered, and oftentimes, more often than not, it kind of gives you an idea of the amount of material I'm going to ask for each part, rather than just that. It will go through and it will ask, and it will tell you kind of how many questions from each chapter I'm going to use.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so sorry, I'm just a little slower today. It's not liking me today, but I have it available. All right, so let me present you the window. All right. Okay. Later. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about unemployment. It is one of those things that we hear a lot about. There's often confusion about it as well. We see the term unemployment, and we see the term unemployment rate, and we see lots of discussion about the job market. Before students take economics and they hear the term unemployment rate, they have an idea of what they think it means, but in reality, it's not what they think it means. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how the government constructs unemployment. We're going to go through some types of unemployment, why we will see unemployment in our economy, why it's not as bad as we think, and ways that why we will always have unemployment. So we're going to go through first how we measure, just like anything, how we measure. Second, we're going to go through something we call natural rate of unemployment. We can also sometimes refer to that as full employment. What do we as economists believe is a good measure of unemployment for the economy? And we're going to talk about why people are unemployed and why there will always be people unemployed and why that's a good thing. We're going to talk about the influence of union and minimum wage laws, as well as efficiency wages. So we'll go through and talk about how each of these things affects unemployment. Not sure why it won't let me erase, but we'll go this way. So what we're going to start with today is how do we calculate unemployment? And that is done through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So if you want to find the unemployment rate in the United States, where you would go is to something called the BLS.gov. And what they do is they take a survey of 60,000 households in the United States. And what we look at is what we consider the adult population. The adult population is anyone 16 years or older. And what they do is they classify people into three categories. You are either employed, unemployed, or not in the labor force. So you get a classification. So in order to calculate our statistics, we need to go through and talk about where each person fits. And so there'll be questions when you get to the homework on Wednesday and on the quiz on Friday that we'll go through, and it will talk about and how do we classify people who are employed. So you're going to have to read the book a little bit. I don't have time to go over all the rules here, but that you can go through the book. It doesn't take a lot of skill. What you'll do is you'll apply the rule. So if I'm a paid employee, if someone paid me to work, I am employed. Doesn't matter how many hours a week I got paid. If I'm self-employed, that means I'm working for myself. I am considered employed. Or anybody who works in a family business. So if you're working for your dad or your mom or your grandfather, you are considered employed. Because even though you may not be receiving a paycheck from them, you are still probably receiving benefits or wages. So remember, to an economist, when we talk about wages, we are talking everything you get paid. So that means not only what's your paycheck, but that could be benefits, that could be time off, that could be flex hours. Everything that your employer gives you is considered a wage to an economist. You know, you may not think of them as wage, you only think of wages as money that goes into your pocket. But as an economist, everything that your employer gives you is considered a wage. They're paying for that. So even though it might not be cash, it might be through other means. So it's all considered part of your wages to an economist. Second part is you're considered unemployed. Now, in the book, it's very, very specific, but I want you to think about what makes me unemployed. I'm unemployed if I have two conditions. Condition one, I'm not working. And condition two is I made an active part of looking for work. So I'm unemployed, one, if I'm not working, and two, I am looking for work. So it requires two parts to be unemployed. And finally, the third part is not in the labor force. This is anyone who's not considered one or two. So mostly the categories of this are students, homemakers, people who are engaged in home production. Could be women, could be men, either way. And if you're retired. So if you've retired from the workforce, you're no longer employed and you're no longer unemployed because you're no longer working. So those are people who are considered not in the labor force. So here, what we have, I can't erase it anymore, don't ask me why, but we're going to go through and I'll use a little bit of the pen here. I have some notes from last time. The first thing we're going to talk about is the unemployment rate and what's called the LFPR, the labor force participation rate. So to look at the employment market in the United States, we need two parts, not just the unemployment rate. We also need to be aware of the labor force participation rate. They're both important parts of the employment picture in the United States. So the first thing we're going to do is, what do we mean by the labor force? So the first thing we want to do is we want to calculate what is the labor force. The labor force is people who are employed and unemployed. So we consider them part of the job market, however you want to make that declaration. That is what the labor force is. So I use the term labor force. It has a very specific meaning. It means the number of people who are employed and unemployed. So it's both. So it's both who's working and who's looking for work. So what we do then is we calculate the unemployment rate from there. So to calculate the unemployment rate is we take the number of people who are unemployed and we divide it by the people in the labor force. This is not the adult population. What a lot of students confuse, oops, should have been a highlighter, is they want to think about is that as the adult population. It is not. It is only the labor force. Now, the labor force participation rate is we look at that as the labor force over the adult population. And we multiply that by 100. Now, why we do this is because it will tell us what percentage of the adult population is actually engaged in a workforce. So, kind of an idea of what's happened with the COVID. So, most of us understand what's happened with COVID is we've seen the unemployment rate has increased significantly. Now, different parts of the country have seen different unemployment rate changes. If you were in New York or California, it's gone through the roof. In Arkansas, it's moved up, but not nearly as bad. So it's not as bad as in Arkansas as it is in other parts of the country. However, if you look at the labor force participation rate, what do we think has happened to the labor force participation rate during COVID? Well, what's happened with the labor force participation rate is it's gone way down. Well, why has it gone way down? Well, part of the discussion, at least if you hear about it, is if you have children at home who are on virtual school, you necessarily, a lot of times it's women, sometimes it's men who have quit their jobs to stay home to help their children in school at home. And so what we've seen with the labor force participation rate is we've seen this huge decrease. I said from 1819, it was starting to eke back up. And then in 2020, it shot way down. And one of the reasons is parents staying at home with their children. Another reason people have been out of the labor force is they were worried about COVID. And they decided they would rather stay at home than go to work. And so what we see is that people have disengaged from the labor force. And so we've seen this number drop significantly. Again, I never give the exact numbers what they are today because they'll change. But if you always want to know and you want to be honest about where to go, you always go to the BLS.gov. And they'll post what's happened to the unemployment rate, what's happened to the labor force participation rate. And they'll show you over months and over years. All right, so how do we calculate here? So active learning, we want to calculate, oh, wow, that's the wrong color. I want to calculate the labor force, unemployment rate, adult population, and labor force participation rate. So what you need to do, you will see a question like this. I can almost guarantee you on a test, a quiz, somewhere. And the first thing you'll do is, what's the labor force? All right, here's the labor force, the employed and unemployed. So 157.9 million plus 6 million. That gives us this 163.9. What's the unemployment rate? Well, the unemployment rate is 169. That's our labor force participation rate. And 6 million are unemployed. So 6 over 163.9 times 100. That's how we find the unemployment rate. How we find the adult population. We take the labor force rate, we take all of these added together. And when you sum all those added together, what you get is 259. To find the labor force participation rate, I take the labor force here, divided by the adult population. So when you go through the slides that are posted on Google, they're clean. They don't have the markings. So you can work these out on your own. And you should. And what you'll find is you'll find the answers. So yes, you will probably need a calculator on your next test. Because unless you can do 6 divided by 163.9 on paper very quickly, or in your head, it won't work so well. So please bring a calculator. Examity should let you use one. Just a reminder, your phone isn't a calculator. And when we go through these numbers, we should be able to come up with all of them. So here's some example in 2019. I just put some on here so we can talk about them. A lot of times we talk about unemployment rates and we talk about there being a difference in unemployment rates. And there is. In 2019, well, that was way back in the good times, the actual national unemployment rate was somewhere around 3.4%. So this was really good times if you compare to today. But what we should notice, and it follows back to our discussion in chapter 12. Remember in chapter 12, we talked about the more human capital you are, the more productive you are. And usually the more productive you are, the greater wage you can command in the market. And the more likely you are to work. Because if you don't work, then the opportunity cost is higher for you to be out of the market. So what do we notice about this relationship between human capital and education? People with no high school degree, their unemployment rate in 2019 was 5.4%. What it is today is you can probably double or triple that rate today. So if we look at students or individuals who don't have a high school diploma, I don't know what the numbers are today, and it would be guessing, but if I'm going to guess, my guess is somewhere between 15 and 20% of these people are out of work. A high school diploma, it'll be up significantly higher. It's probably 7.2. College will probably be about 6.2, 4.2. So what does that tell me? Well, that tells me a lot of the unemployment rate is going to be dictated by how productive we are. And students who drop out of school are more likely to be unemployed. And one of the reasons is employers going to have to pay wages that equal your productivity. If you're not going to produce as much value for the company than your wage, they will never hire you. So your wage has to be at least equivalent to your productivity. And we also hence see the same story happen in labor force participation rates. Those with bachelor's degrees are more likely to be engaged in the labor force. And that's through all ages, all races, all genders. The numbers might not be exactly the same, but the story is. The story is always the same. More education, lower unemployment rate, higher labor force participation rate. So here we're going to talk about a couple of definitions. What do we mean by the natural rate of unemployment? That was supposed to be a stupid highlighter. What do I mean by a natural rate of unemployment? And what do I mean by cyclical? So what we have here is a natural rate of unemployment. It is what we call full employment in the United States. So that's just a fancy term for full employment, or what we will call a good number. So if I asked you, and I will, not necessarily directly, but part of understanding where things fall in this world is we should know what's a good number. Again, what the number is exactly at a given time, we don't know. But what we want to know is what's a good number. So for the United States, a good number is right around 5%. Now again, if you look in the book, the natural rate will fluctuate between 4.8 and 5.5%. And we'll talk about, it's based on some other characteristics, which we'll get to. But as kind of when you leave this class and you have to look at what the unemployment rate is, and when you become a voting citizen, you aren't going to go, well, I wonder what the actual natural rate is. No, you're going to have to kind of leave here with what we call a rule of thumb. So a rule of thumb is anything around 5% is good. For the United States economy, 5% is good. And that just kind of gives us an idea, kind of a rule of thumb. And if times are bad, we'll have something called cyclical unemployment, and it will be positive. So this is the deviation. So if we have 10% unemployment, and we should be at 5, that means we have 5% of unemployment caused because of what we call cyclical unemployment. This is due to economic conditions that change. Sometimes things are good, sometimes things are not good. And when things are really good, we actually have a negative cyclical unemployment. So actually, if we were in 2019, we were running actually a negative cyclical unemployment. So that means the economic conditions were very good. And we actually saw negative cyclical unemployment. It's the only unemployment that can be negative. Everything else is positive. I don't really like the term unemployment here because it's not really what it is. It's kind of this change. But the book uses that term, so we're going to use that term. But it's really the change from the natural rate. So here's my graph. I said, here's what things look like if we look at it from the last 30 years. As I said, the natural rate kind of fluctuates between about 5.5 and about 4.8. And here's where we were in 2019 before the pandemic. We were at almost historically low rates. When the pandemic hit, what happens is I drew the picture up here, is we shot through the roof. And we went all the way up to 11 or 12%. So there was this huge influx that shutting down businesses did. And it did, is it shot the unemployment rate through the roof. And it's been the highest since the Great Depression. That actually used to belong to the 1980 recession, but we have now surpassed that one. But thankfully, we're moving down very quickly from this high unemployment rate. What we have here is another one that looks at labor force participation rate. And what you notice is for men, labor force participation rate has been falling. So from World War II until today, labor force participation rate for men has actually been decreasing. And for women, we've seen an increasing labor force participation rate. So why have we seen these changes in rates? So why have we seen these changes in rates for men and women? Where'd my slides go? So let's talk about this. So why have we seen these changes in labor force participation rate? So what's changed that have allowed women to join the workforce? So what are the major reasons we see this uptake in labor force participation rate? Why have we seen this increase? One, we've seen change in attitudes. Sorry, my penmanship is bad. But we've seen change in attitudes. We've seen the role of women has changed over time, and our acceptance of that has increased. That is one reason. That is what some people have cited as a reason. One of the major reasons that we have actually seen more women in the workforce is that we've seen what we call a change in technology in what we call home production. And how have we seen that change in technology? We'll call them dishwashers, washing machines, dryers. A lot of that has freed up time or made our home production more efficient. Now, whether right or wrong, women often engaged in home production. And so what that required is keeping the house in order, doing groceries, doing laundry, doing what we call as economist home production, taking care of the house. And that required a lot of labor-intensive jobs. If we go back to the 50s and look at it, that required a lot of labor-intensive jobs. That's another one, Taylor. We'll get to that one in a second. They're waiting longer to have children or having less children. But in reality, a lot of it is this change in technology. As it became more efficient. Think about it today. Think about how we've changed home production. I think about grocery shopping. Think about washing dishes, washing clothes, vacuuming. Almost all of that you can almost set up to do automatically on its own. Right? You have vacuums that will clean your own house and you don't even have to push the vacuum around anymore. You can pick up your groceries from Walmart without even having to step in the store. Washing machines have come about, dishwashers have come about. And as they became more efficient, it freed up time. And as it was primarily women, but it wasn't just exclusively women. But as they had more time, then they could engage in work outside of the house. And a lot of them did. And there's also changes, as Taylor said, in attitudes about when they have children and they have less children. You can almost kind of focus this on technology and home production. Is that the household became smaller and became less need for labor-intensive jobs there. So that's why we've seen this huge increase in women's labor force participation. What about men's? Why have the men decreased? Why have we seen males' labor force rate decrease? Well, one, we do see more we'll call, it's probably not the politically correct term, but we see more dads engaged in home production is the politically correct term. But most people just refer to them, we see more stay-at-home dads. But where women typically, either through attitudes or societal pressure, engaged a lot in home production, we are now starting to see role reversals. And we see more dads engaging in home production than we have before. Not a lot more, but we do see some more. And what they do is they're now responsible for running the households while women have gone out and engaged in the workforce. Again, how that's decided in the household, we can always go back to our comparative advantage discussion. Who has the comparative advantage? Who has the absolute advantage? Where does each household fit there? How should the household allocate its resources? It comes down to comparative advantage and what trade-offs do they make. Second thing, education. We've seen more education levels, well, in both men and women, but with the women, with these things have caused so much of an up push, we can't see any down pushes. So for men, though, we do see this down push of education levels. As they go to school longer, they're less likely to be engaged in the workforce. 3, they retire earlier, at least compared to time. One of my favorite examples was, if you look at the 1950s, the life expectancy for men was 67. The retirement age was 68. You're thinking, how can that be? Well, all men were born, and we count all of them in the life expectancy. So they would live on average till 67, but retirement age actually requires an action, and they wouldn't actually retire until well past their life expectancy. So what we saw in the 50s was most men worked until they died. And so Social Security wasn't much of a problem because there wasn't a lot of people on it. Think about it, men worked till they died, so they weren't going to ever really collect Social Security. However, today, the average retirement age, life expectancy is 78, and men average retire at 62. So what does that mean? Well, we have a lot of men now who are retired and are still going to live 16, 17 more years after they retire. And as they do that, they're drawing on Social Security. So some of the issues we've seen with Social Security is, well, because attitudes have changed about workforce. So when we set it up in the 50s, well, people worked till they died, so I didn't really have to worry about Social Security. Today, that's not true. And so what we see is this huge issue with Social Security because people are living longer. That's good from societal standpoint. We have people live longer. I like my grandparents to live longer, my parents. But from a Social Security issue, that becomes a problem we didn't plan for. And if you quickly pay attention to politics, that's hard for them to change. Either taxing more, paying out less, or increasing returns are all very difficult for them to get done politically. So they don't. And now finally, the last one. This one dates the book author and it'll date me. The book talks about something called a Kramer effect. Now, Kramer, for those of you who don't know, is a character from a famous television show referred to as Seinfeld. Now, I don't know how many of you have actually seen Seinfeld. My guess is very, very few. But what Kramer does in Seinfeld is if you ask me, what does he do? Well, he doesn't really work, or he works sometimes, or very little. He's not really unemployed. He's never really looking for work. What he does is mostly sit around his apartment goofing off all day. And what we find is we find a lot of men who are disengaged from the workforce. They're either not working and they're not looking for work. So they're not employed or not unemployed. And they're not stay-at-home dads either. They're not engaging in work production. What they're doing all day, this is stereotypical, but we're just going to kind of put it out there. What they're doing all day is nothing. They're playing video games. They're watching TV. The fancy term is they're engaging in leisure activity. A stay-at-home dad is running the household, cooking, cleaning, taking care of household production. A man on the Kramer effect is doing video games, watching TV. I guess now he could be playing on social media. He's not engaged in anything productive. He's not getting paid. He's just goofing off. The fancy term for goofing off is engaging in leisure activity. Since he's not doing any of that, he's not productive. And we see more and more men falling into this category. And why it's worrisome is they aren't picking up any life skills. And so what happens when their benefactor, typically either their mom, or oftentimes a girlfriend, decides they don't want them around anymore, they have a hard time going into the labor force as they're not ready or able to get into the labor force. So it's starting to become an issue, and economists have started to pay attention to it. It's especially prevalent or a bigger increase among men than it is women. There have been women that have engaged in that as well, but it's a new problem, especially among men. And it starts to worry about what happens when they've never engaged in the labor force. What do we do with them? So, are there limitations to the unemployment rate? So let's talk about this unemployment rate. Let's talk about, are there limitations? What are the limitations? What happens to the unemployment rate? So it doesn't really show very well on Google Meet, or I'm not very good enough to get it to show on Google Meet very well. But what I have there is a YouTube video. So when you go through the slides, click on it. What it does is it does a very good job of kind of explaining, kind of a game show format, who is and who is not unemployed. And what it does is it talks about the labor market and how not always are our numbers correct. And what this mostly focuses on is the 2007 and 2009 unemployment rate. So let's look at these three people that I've talked about, and let's see if we can figure out who's unemployed, who's employed, who's not in the labor force. So let's start with the first one. Haley lost her job, so she's not working, and she's looking for a new one. So the answer is yes, she is in the labor force and unemployed. Let's look at this next one, Josiah. Now, what about Josiah? He's not working. However, he has become what is called discouraged and gives up looking. So because he gave up looking, Josiah is now considered not in the labor force. He is category 3. He is not employed and he's not unemployed. So he's not in the labor force. Now, what about Kareem here? Kareem, sole earner, his family of 5. He just lost his $80,000 job as a research scientist. So he had a very good job working as a research scientist. All of a sudden, he lost it for whatever reason. However, because he's the one earning money for his family, he says, well, I need to go find work. So what he does is he works at McDonald's until he can find another job in his field. Kareem, even though he's not working at a job where he's qualified for, though he is still working, he is considered employed. Because remember, before, the definition of employed was, were you working? And the answer is, he is working. He takes a part-time job. So he is working. He is considered employed. So because of this, since Haley is considered unemployed, what we get is an increase in the unemployment rate because she became newly unemployed. So the unemployment rate rises because the number of employed increases. Labor force stays the same. She went from employed to unemployed, so that didn't change. And since the unemployment rate is rising, that gives us the correct impression. The labor market is worse. Unemployment is going up. Labor market dictates that. That's a true statement. Now, what about Josiah here? We talked about Josiah before. He's what we call a discouraged worker. And I talked about before, he is considered as not in the labor force. And well, what happens when Josiah goes from unemployed, he gives up looking, to not in the labor force? Well, actually, the unemployment rate falls because Josiah is no longer considered unemployed. So what happens is the unemployment rate actually goes down. And because the unemployment rate falls, this gives us the impression that the labor market rate is improving, but it is not. If the unemployment rate falls, and the labor force participation rate is also falling, that is not a good sign. If the unemployment rate is falling and the labor force participation rate is rising, that is a good sign. So the unemployment rate doesn't have the power to tell us exactly what is happening in the labor market. It is only a piece of the picture. You have to understand both the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. Now, if you watch the news media, they never tell you the labor force participation rate, or if they do, it's just in passing. It's like, oh, the unemployment rate is 10% and the labor force participation rate is 60%. Rarely do you hear the second part. In reality, you need both parts to have a good picture of what's happening to the unemployment rate. So we talked to C, Kareem loses his job, and he found another one at McDonald's. The unemployment rate didn't change because he's still considered employed. Everything stayed the same. Nothing changed in our diagram. However, it's obvious. Now, again, I don't know what part-time jobs at McDonald's pay, but I'm going to guess they don't pay $80,000 a year. So for Kareem, things are definitely worse, but I didn't see it in the unemployment rate. And so as economists, we worry about that. Since we don't see these things, how do we try to make sure the numbers are going to give us a good picture? So that's why we do both the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. That sometimes helps. However, even here with C with Kareem, it wouldn't even still give us a good picture. What happens is we start to, as economists, if you go and look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and if you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what you will find is I don't even know how many they're at. I think they're now at 7 unemployment rates. So what they try to do is they try to look at different things that happen in the job market to try to give us a better picture of what things are happening. As economists, we focus only on what's called the official one. And if you go look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I believe they call it U3. And it actually just says U3, and usually in parentheses, it says the official rate. That's the rate that everyone uses. And why do we use this one? Is because we have historical measures of this. We've recognized in the past 20 years that this one isn't very good, as we've shown. So what economists did is they came up with better ones to hopefully try to give us a new picture. At some point, we'll have enough historical measures of these newer ones that we can start to make decisions about looking at the economy. So when we talk about unemployment, what do we mean and how long are people unemployed? So economists have looked at unemployment for a long time, and what we find is that what we call spells of unemployment are short. What the heck do I mean by that? That means how long people are unemployed. Most people who are unemployed find a job very quickly. So, and even 2/3 are out by 14 weeks. So that means if we have 3 people who are unemployed, within 3 months, 2 of them have found a job. And then, however, we still have this one that has not. And the problem is most of unemployment we observe as we observe it here, is for these people who have been long-term unemployed. So most of the unemployment we're looking at is these people who have been long-term unemployed. It doesn't matter what period we use. If you look at today with COVID, still lots of people were able to sometimes find a job very quickly. It was a little harder than usual. However, most people who have been unemployed have been that way for a long time. And it's harder the longer you're out of work to find a new job unless you have new skills. So we're going to stop today at where I'm at. I'm going to find my original slides without my markings. I thought I had them, but I did not. They're posted, but I couldn't get them open on my computer because they want to open them in Google Slides, and I can't write on Google Slides for some weird reason. But what we're going to do on Wednesday is we're going to finish our discussion of unemployment. What we're going to focus on are why we have unemployment in the U.S. economy. And the two reasons we have unemployment in the U.S. economy are frictional and structural unemployment. And we're going to talk about how that occurs, why that occurs. And we're going to talk about, is there a role for government in increasing or decreasing those unemployment rates? All right, are there any other questions?
On the course calendar,
Yes.
the Friday before spring break, there's
Yes.
according to the course calendar, it's a practice test too that's due.
Well, you can do that whenever you want, because that's the day of the test. The practice test doesn't count for any points. If you notice, there's 0 points.
So it's just the actual exam too that's due that Friday.
The actual exam is
Okay.
due that Friday as well. It should be on the course calendar too, isn't it?
Unless I've missed it, it was just that practice test.
The real test is due that day as well. If it's not on the calendar, it should be.
Yeah, it's the 19th.
Yeah, the 19th is the actual date of the next test. So next week we'll take the test. What I will do is, since it's the Friday before spring break, I will open it up for a couple more days. So I will let you take it anywhere from Tuesday to Friday of next week. So I will send out an announcement later today updating it. But if you check on the syllabus, I know the dates on the syllabus. I thought it was on the course calendar, but it's not. I apologize for that. But it will